Michael Carter had spent the evening at a small restaurant near Capitol Hill, sharing stories and laughter with colleagues from Georgetown University. The warmth of intellectual debate still lingered in his mind as he walked toward his car. The night air was crisp, the streets of Washington, D.C. humming with the distant sounds of the city. He adjusted his blazer, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. A professor of constitutional law, Michael had dedicated his career to dissecting the complexities of justice. But as the red and blue lights of a patrol car flashed behind him, illuminating the brick buildings around him, he was about to experience a lesson he had never prepared for. "Sir, stop right there." The voice was firm, authoritative. Michael turned to see two officers stepping out of the squad car. One was in his early 30s, tall, with a buzz cut, Officer Bradley Cooper. The other, Sergeant Rick Dawson, was older, bulkier, and had the air of a man who had spent decades patrolling these streets with unchecked confidence. Michael stopped, his breath steady. He knew better than to make any sudden movements. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. Dawson's eyes scanned him from head to toe. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for." Michael frowned. "What description?" Cooper crossed his arms. "Black male, late 30s, wearing a dark blazer. We got a report about a robbery nearby." Michael let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You just described half the men in this city." Dawson's expression hardened. "Hands out of your pockets." Michael hesitated. "Look, I'm a professor at Georgetown. I was just having dinner down the street. This is a mistake." Dawson stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "Then you won't mind showing us some ID." Michael sighed and reached into his inside pocket, moving slowly. He pulled out his wallet, but before he could fully extend it, Dawson grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" Michael protested. Dawson shoved him against the cold metal of the patrol car. "Just making sure you don't try anything stupid." Michael felt his chest tighten as his face was pressed against the vehicle. "This is unnecessary. I haven't done anything." People walked past on the sidewalk, some pausing, their eyes flickering with curiosity and discomfort. None of them spoke up. "Professor, huh?" Dawson muttered, pulling Michael's wallet from his hand. He flipped it open, glancing at the Georgetown faculty ID. "Fancy title. Doesn't mean shit on these streets." Michael clenched his jaw. "I know my rights." Dawson smirked. "Do you now?" He nodded at Cooper, who started patting Michael down, running his hands roughly along his torso, down his legs. "He's clean," Cooper muttered. Michael exhaled sharply. "Then we're done here." Dawson didn't move. Instead, he exchanged a glance with Cooper before reaching for his radio. Bringing him in for further questioning. Michael's stomach dropped. "What? You just searched me. You have nothing." Dawson yanked Michael's wrists behind him. The sharp metal of the handcuffs bit into his skin. "Resisting arrest." Dawson taunted. Michael's pulse pounded. "This is unlawful." Dawson leaned in, his breath hot against Michael's ear. "File a complaint. See how far that gets you." The cold dread in Michael's stomach turned to a fiery rage. He had lectured about cases like this. He had debated the failures of the system with his students. And now, here he was, a textbook example of injustice. Cooper opened the back door of the squad car and shoved Michael inside. The door slammed shut, sealing him in the stale air of the back seat. The police radio crackled as Dawson muttered something unintelligible. Michael stared through the metal mesh separating him from the front of the car. His mind was a storm. He was not just any man. He was the brother of the most powerful legal figure in the country. Would they realize that before it was too late? At the 4th District Metropolitan Police Station, Michael sat on a metal bench inside a cramped holding cell. The room smelled of sweat and old coffee. No explanations. No rights read to him. No lawyer. He had demanded to make a phone call, but they ignored him. When he asked again, Dawson leaned against the bars and grinned. "You're real impatient, huh? Sit tight." Michael clenched his fists. This was deliberate. They wanted him to feel powerless. Two younger officers walked past, whispering. One glanced at him, then quickly looked away. They knew something was wrong with this. But no one spoke up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Cooper returned with a lazy shrug. "All right, Professor. You get one call." Michael was led to a phone, his wrists finally freed from the cuffs. His hands were stiff, sore. He forced his fingers to move as he dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang once, twice, then Anthony Carter. Michael exhaled. "It's me." A beat of silence. Then Anthony's voice dropped into a low, dangerous calm. "Where are you?" Michael swallowed hard. 4th District Precinct. "I was stopped. They said I matched a description." Anthony cut him off. "Are you hurt?" Michael's eyes flickered toward Dawson, who was watching him with a smug grin. He forced his voice to stay even. "No. But they're holding me without cause. They won't say why." Another silence. Then, Anthony's voice came back, cold and controlled. "Don't say another word. I'm coming." Michael slowly put the phone down. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the shift in power that was about to come. Dawson chuckled from behind him. "Hope you called a good lawyer, Professor. You're gonna need one." Michael turned to him, meeting his eyes for the first time with absolute certainty. "You have no idea who I just called." Michael sat back down on the cold bench inside the holding cell, his fingers still tingling from the tight grip of the handcuffs. The humiliation settled deep in his bones. His shirt was wrinkled, his blazer slightly askew, small details, but they symbolized something greater. They had stripped him of his dignity, even if just for a moment. Across the room, Sergeant Dawson leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a smug expression resting on his face. He wasn't worried. In his eyes, this was routine, a black man in a holding cell, another night on the job. "So, Professor," Dawson finally spoke, his voice thick with condescension. "How does it feel to be on the other side of the law?" Michael ignored him. Dawson chuckled, nudging Officer Cooper, who stood nearby. "They all think they're too good for this place, don't they? But look at him. Just another guy in cuffs, like the rest." Michael clenched his fists. He had spent years teaching students about constitutional rights, due process, and the abuse of power. Now, he was staring straight into the face of the very system he had criticized. A system that didn't care who you were. The room was quiet except for the hum of the overhead lights and the occasional static from the police radio. Then, the phone at the front desk rang. Michael watched as an officer picked it up. His posture shifted almost immediately, shoulders stiffening. He turned to the others in the room. Sergeant, you might want to take this." Dawson rolled his eyes and grabbed the receiver. "Yeah. Who is this?" A pause. Then, his face changed. Michael couldn't hear what was being said, but he knew exactly who was on the other end. "Anthony." Dawson's smug confidence drained. He stiffened, nodding slightly, his fingers tightening around the receiver. "Yes, sir. Yes, I understand." Another pause. His jaw twitched. Yes. Of course. No, sir, I wasn't aware." He hung up the phone slowly. The room felt heavier. Michael didn't move. He wanted to savor this moment, the exact second when Dawson realized he had made a terrible mistake. Dawson turned toward him, his face a shade paler. For the first time since this ordeal began, he wasn't in control. Michael raised an eyebrow. "Problem, Sergeant?" Dawson inhaled sharply, his lips pressing into a thin line. He motioned to Cooper. "Get him out of there." Cooper hesitated. "Sir, you heard me." Michael stood slowly as the officer unlocked the cell door. Every movement was deliberate. They had shoved him in there like a criminal. He would not rush to leave. As he stepped forward, Dawson avoided his gaze. He couldn't even look at him now. But Michael wasn't done. He smoothed his blazer, exhaled, and spoke in a calm, measured voice. "What's the charge, Sergeant?" Dawson clenched his jaw. "There isn't one." Michael tilted his head. "No, that's odd. Because you were very confident when you shoved me in here." Cooper shifted uncomfortably. Even he could feel how badly this had turned. Michael took another step closer, his voice lowering just enough to be dangerous. "Tell me something, Dawson. Was it worth it? Dawson's nostrils flared. He couldn't answer. Michael nodded, then walked past him. But just before he reached the door, he heard it. A whisper. Should have deleted it sooner. Michael froze. Slowly, he turned his head. Dawson was looking at Cooper, shaking his head slightly, as if his partner had just made a crucial mistake. Michael's pulse slowed. The pieces clicked into place. Something had been deleted, and he was about to find out exactly what it was. Anthony Carter arrived minutes later. The doors of the 4th District Police Station burst open, and the room fell silent. Anthony was not just any man. He was the United States Attorney General, the country's highest-ranking law enforcement officer. He walked in flanked by 2 aides, his tailored suit crisp, his presence commanding. His face was unreadable, calm, controlled. But Michael could see it. The storm beneath. Dawson straightened immediately. "Sir, Anthony held up a hand. Dawson shut up. Anthony's gaze cut through the room like a blade. "Who put my brother in that cell?" No one spoke. Michael stepped forward. Dawson and Cooper. Anthony's dark eyes locked onto the officers. "Is that true?" Cooper swallowed hard. Dawson said nothing. Anthony exhaled slowly. He nodded once, then turned toward Michael. "Let's go." But Michael didn't move. He could have walked out of there, let his brother handle the fallout. But he wasn't done. He turned back to Dawson. "What did you delete?" Dawson's eyes flickered with something. Fear? Annoyance? "I don't know what you're talking about." Michael stepped closer. "That's funny. Because your partner here just told you that you should have deleted it sooner. So tell me, Sergeant, what was it?" Anthony glanced at Dawson, his expression sharpening. Now he was interested. Dawson's fists clenched. "You're free to go, Carter. Walk away." Michael smiled. "No." He turned to Anthony. "They're hiding something." Anthony studied Dawson for a long moment, then pulled out his phone. "Deputy Director Monroe. I need you at the 4th District Precinct." "Now." The moment Anthony said the name, Dawson visibly paled. Michael had been right. Something was hidden. And now, they weren't just dealing with a wrongfully arrested professor. They were dealing with the Attorney General of the United States. And he was about to burn this place to the ground. Michael stood beside Anthony, watching Sergeant Dawson's face drain of color. The mention of Deputy Director Monroe had struck a nerve, confirming what Michael already suspected. They had deleted something. A tense silence filled the precinct. The low hum of police radios and the distant shuffle of paperwork were the only sounds breaking it. Anthony slid his phone back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. But Michael knew him well enough to recognize the shift. His brother wasn't just angry, he was calculating. Michael crossed his arms. "You're stalling, Dawson." Dawson's jaw tightened. "You're free to go. Take the win." Michael shook his head. "The win? You think this is about me? You think this is just some minor inconvenience?" Anthony stepped forward, his voice cold and precise. "Where is the footage?" Cooper, the younger officer, shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted to Dawson, hesitation creeping into his stance. Michael caught it immediately. "He knows." Michael turned to him, his voice lowering. "You can still do the right thing, Officer Cooper. You can still walk away from this with your career intact." Cooper swallowed hard, his face conflicted. Dawson shot him a glare. "Shut up, Cooper." Cooper flinched but stayed silent. Anthony smirked, a predator who had just spotted weakness. He turned his attention back to Dawson. "The footage was deleted, correct?" Dawson exhaled sharply. "There is no footage." Michael took a step closer. "You don't even sound convinced of that." Dawson glared at him, his nostrils flaring. "You think because your brother is some big shot, you're untouchable?" Michael smiled slightly. "No, Dawson. I think because my brother is the Attorney General, I have the resources to dig up exactly what you're trying to hide." Dawson's silence spoke volumes. Then, the doors slammed open. Deputy Director Richard Monroe walked in, his sharp gray suit a stark contrast to the chaos in the room. A powerful figure within the Metropolitan Police Department, Monroe was known for his no-nonsense approach and for hating public scandals. His eyes scanned the room, quickly assessing the situation. "What the hell is going on here?" Anthony turned to him. "We have reason to believe that footage related to my brother's unlawful arrest was deleted. I want to know by whom." Monroe's expression darkened. His gaze snapped to Dawson. "Tell me that's not true." Dawson straightened, trying to regain control. "Sir, this is a misunderstanding. The suspect—" He stopped himself, realizing his mistake. Michael was no longer a suspect. Monroe exhaled through his nose, his patience visibly thinning. "Dawson. Cooper. My office. Now." Dawson hesitated. "Sir, Monroe's voice was like steel. "Now." Dawson had no choice but to comply. But as he turned to leave, Michael spoke again. "This isn't over, Dawson." Dawson stopped, barely turning his head. "For your sake, Carter, you better hope it is." And then he was gone. Michael and Anthony exchanged a glance. Something bigger was happening here, and they were about to rip it wide open. 1 hour later, Michael sat in Anthony's sleek black car, parked just outside the Department of Justice. The adrenaline from earlier had begun to settle, but the unease in his chest remained. Anthony, sitting in the driver's seat, tapped his fingers against the steering wheel. His mind was somewhere else, already 3 steps ahead, calculating his next move. Michael broke the silence. "That video is still out there." Anthony nodded. "If it was deleted, it was because it's damning. Which means someone had access to it before it was erased." Michael leaned back, exhaling. "We need to find it." Anthony's eyes remained on the road ahead. "I already have someone working on it." Michael turned to him. "You do?" Anthony smirked. "I always have a backup plan." Michael wasn't surprised. His brother never played defense, only offense. And if the police thought this was over, they were about to learn the hard way. It had just begun. Michael sat in the dimly lit office of Assistant U.S. Attorney Lisa Reynolds, watching as she scrolled through her laptop with an intensity that told him they were onto something. Lisa was one of Anthony's most trusted allies, a prosecutor with a sharp mind and an unwavering intolerance for corruption. She had been working with Anthony behind the scenes since the moment he learned of Michael's arrest. She exhaled sharply. "Got it." Michael and Anthony leaned in. Lisa turned the screen toward them. There it was. A traffic camera feed from across the street, time-stamped at the exact moment of Michael's arrest. And it showed everything. The aggressive way Dawson had approached. How Michael had cooperated, calm, non-threatening, and how Dawson had escalated anyway. The unnecessary force. The moment Michael was slammed against the patrol car. And then, the worst part. Dawson and Cooper exchanging a glance before Cooper reached for his body camera. The feed didn't have audio, but the body language was unmistakable. Cooper hesitated. Dawson nodded. And then, Cooper turned the camera off. Michael clenched his jaw. There it is. Lisa nodded. This was never about a suspect matching a description. It was about power. About control. And when they realized what they had done, they covered it up. Anthony's face was stone cold. He tapped his fingers against the desk, his expression unreadable. Then he stood. Time to make them regret it. The confrontation. That night, Sergeant Dawson sat in his car, parked in an empty lot behind a rundown convenience store. His nerves were on edge. He had spent the entire afternoon dodging calls from higher-ups. Monroe was furious. Internal Affairs was sniffing around. And he knew why. Carter wasn't letting this go. He took a deep breath, rubbing his temples. This was supposed to be a routine stop. A minor inconvenience for some professor who thought he was above the law. No. It was a goddamn nightmare. A knock on his window startled him. He turned sharply, only to see Anthony Carter standing outside. Dawson's heart pounded. How the hell did he find him? Slowly, he rolled the window down. What do you want? Anthony's expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, dangerous. I want to offer you a choice. Dawson scoffed. A choice? You came all the way down here to threaten me? Anthony smirked. No, Dawson. I came here to remind you that you're out of options. Dawson clenched his jaw. Anthony pulled out his phone and pressed play. The traffic cam footage. Dawson's face drained of color. Anthony leaned down, resting his hands on the car door. Here's how this plays out. Option 1. You resign. Quietly. No pension. No retirement benefits. You disappear, and this footage never sees the light of day. Dawson swallowed hard. And option 2. Anthony's smile faded. I bury you. Dawson felt his breath hitch. I will personally make sure you are stripped of your badge, dragged into court, and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Obstruction of justice. Tampering with evidence. Civil rights violations. You will never work in law enforcement again. Dawson's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Anthony stepped back. So, what's it gonna be? A long silence. Then, Dawson looked away. He had lost. And he knew it. The aftermath. The next morning, headlines exploded across the country. D.C. Sergeant resigns amid racial profiling scandal. Attorney General's brother wrongfully detained. Internal investigation launched. Body cam manipulation. New questions arise in MPD accountability. Michael sat in his office at Georgetown, scrolling through the coverage. The humiliation he had endured was now fuel for something greater. A knock at the door made him look up. Anthony leaned against the frame, a small smile on his lips. Told you I had a backup plan. Michael exhaled, setting his phone down. What happens now? Anthony's expression grew serious. No. We make sure this never happens again. Michael nodded. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every black man who had ever been humiliated, harassed, or treated like a suspect for simply existing. And this time, the system had to answer for it. Michael sat in the grand hearing room of the United States Senate, his hands clasped together as he listened to the murmurs of politicians, journalists, and legal experts filling the space. The past week had been a whirlwind. His unlawful arrest had turned into a national debate, and now, the Senate Judiciary Committee was holding a hearing on police accountability. He was no longer just a professor. He had become a symbol of a broken system. Anthony sat beside him, as composed as ever. Across the room, Deputy Director Monroe was testifying, attempting to minimize the scandal, but the evidence was overwhelming. The traffic cam footage had made it impossible to ignore. Senator Rachel McAllister, a sharp-tongued lawmaker known for her relentless questioning, leaned forward. Mr. Monroe, can you confirm whether Sergeant Dawson and Officer Cooper knowingly tampered with body cam evidence? Monroe adjusted his tie. The internal investigation is ongoing, but preliminary findings suggest. McAllister cut him off. Yes or no? Monroe hesitated. Then, finally, yes. The room erupted in whispers. Michael exhaled slowly. They had won. The fallout. Over the next few days, the consequences cascaded like dominoes. Sergeant Dawson's resignation became a dismissal. Charges were brought against him, and he now faced criminal prosecution for evidence tampering and civil rights violations. Officer Cooper turned against him. In a desperate attempt to save his own career, Cooper testified against Dawson, confirming that he had deleted the footage under direct orders. The Metropolitan Police Department faced an internal shakeup. Several high-ranking officers were forced to step down, and new policies regarding body cam transparency were introduced. But the most significant shift: the national conversation. Michael's story had become a catalyst for police reform discussions across the country. New policies were proposed at both the state and federal levels, aiming to hold officers accountable for body cam misuse and wrongful arrests. For years, Michael had taught about systemic injustice. Now he had lived it, and he had fought back. 1 month later, Michael walked into his classroom at Georgetown University, the weight of the past month still lingering in his chest. His students sat quietly, waiting. They had all seen the news. They had watched their professor become the very subject of the lectures he had given for years. He set his briefcase down, took a breath, and looked at them. Then he spoke. The law is supposed to protect us all. His voice was steady, but filled with meaning. But the truth is, justice is only as strong as the people who demand it. A beat of silence. And if we don't fight back, nothing changes. The room was completely still. Then, a student raised her hand. "Professor Carter, would you do it all over again?" Michael thought about it. The humiliation, the anger, the fear, and then the victory. He smiled. In a heartbeat,